The title of this conference is going to be The Healing of a Man. And as a guide, I'm going to take Gabor Mate at the beginning, since I'm going to begin with the problem of addictions. Gabor Mate was a doctor in Vancouver working with drug addicts for many years. And he has this to say as a definition that goes beyond just the problem of substance abuse. He would describe addiction as a behavioral problem that has to do with seeking pleasure. This specific behavior, there is this craving, and it has negative consequences. The person becomes eventually unmanageable. The person would like to be able to stop the specific behavior, but is not able to do it. And so we can see here that we're not just talking about drugs or alcohol. We're talking about other types of behaviors that could be gambling, it could be food, it could be sex, it could be relationships, it could be work, it could be even extreme sports. People can, in that sense, become addicted to almost anything. But there is a characteristic here. And what we're talking about is not just that there is bad habit, something that this person chose to do, as if they could be told just stop doing it and that is it. No. And it is not just like a brain disease, let's say, or a disorder. We're talking about a behavior, some type of compulsivity, where the person has become enslaved to this type of behavior. And actually that's where the word addiction comes from the Latin addictus, which was a slave that was made such through a court ruling. So we see the definition, a person who lives under sin. St. Paul talks about the sinner in those terms, someone who is enslaved to sin and his own condition, that he would like to stop performing certain acts that he doesn't want to perform, and he doesn't perform the acts that he would like to perform. So there is a sense of incapacity to overcome this type of behavior. It's not just a bad habit. For example, someone may have a bad habit of picking their nose because there is probably no craving here. The characteristic element that we're talking about here in addictions are these three. One, seeking of pleasure. There is a craving. Two, it has negative consequences on life. And three, problem of the person not being able to overcome it. And so if we understand that addiction is not a disease, but an attempt to solve a problem, then the question is going to be, where is this problem coming from? If addiction is understood as an attempt to be able to deal with anxiety, the question is going to be, where is that anxiety coming from? And that is where we're going to go to adverse child experiences. If you were going to ask me, does everybody who suffers adverse child experiences or some trauma ends up addicted? The answer is going to be no. Best studies have been able to reveal that over 2/3 of those who go through substance abuse and addictions, drugs, they had traumatic events during their childhood. And so here we see that there is a relationship. The worst, the adverse childhood experiences that these kids had, the more likelihood exponentially that they would eventually develop some type of addiction in their lives. And even when they didn't develop addictions, there were other negative psychological consequences in their lives, like depression, some type of anxiety disorder. Eventually, we see this correlation, even when the person says, I had a happy childhood. And we can ask them, how was the emotional memory when you were growing up? At times, the parent was distant. There is a dissociation in many things that are forgotten. At times, the kid suffer from just neglect. And so eventually we're going to see that there is this correlation in the emotional tuning of the child that is very much associated to the parent. That is where all these problems originate. So let's look at another commonality between the substance abuse, drug addiction, and some behavioral addictions. It has to do with brain circuitry, biochemical inside the brain, dopamine. It is that hormone that brings about satisfaction inside, that pleasure seeking reward system that we have, and that activates this compulsivity in the person eventually. From that point of view, we have the same behavior. When the person that is doing gambling, sex addict, or a workaholic, what is it that brings back that person to the behavior even when they're trying to overcome it? It is the poor stress regulation again and again. And so this is something that is common in many people, and it is part of our brokenness, our wounded nature. Anxiety rules our lives. Addiction eventually progresses and it becomes worse and worse. It can begin as some type of experimentation. Could be just trying out drugs or alcohol with some types of behavior like gambling. The workaholic may enjoy the success that he is receiving because of his efforts. But then this becomes a lifestyle. And so the person relies more and more on this type of activity. It has become the way of being, and he starts neglecting other activities in his life. Eventually, as this progresses and becomes more accentuated in someone's life, then you have this situation where the person cannot live without it. It is the way to be able to regulate one's own anxiety and emotional pain. And then finally, you have the full-blown addiction where you start neglecting other people. You become so self-centered, so self-absorbed that you neglect family, you neglect relationships. The workaholic may eventually neglect family. And so you have moments of darkness because everything starts falling apart. This darkness is going to become very important. Father Benedict Rochelle has so much to say about this in a very beautiful book that he has called Spiritual Passages. This darkness is maybe the way through which reality can be perceived beyond the defense mechanisms that we have. This darkness has such a way as to be able to break through these defense mechanisms. The voice of God now can begin to be heard inside of ourselves. And that is important. And so this darkness brings about a tremendous humiliation. Who would like to accept defeat? Especially when addiction has become full-blown. People have lost their jobs, or there was a divorce, you lost your children, many of the things that you love the most, you ended up in poverty. There were other types of sins, and eventually you lost recognition, and there's nothing that you can do in order to be able to recover them, to make them better. So you're in a tremendous crisis, but this crisis is something that God has allowed for a greater good. You're going to have to overcome immature ways to relate to God. The type of childish faith whereby the child promises to be good in order to be able to get what the child wants, or the teenage type of or adolescent faith whereby I believe in God insofar as I understand Him. And so these ways of relating to God are going to have to be overcome, being able to let go of all resources and completely trust. A trust that is going to leave aside all desire to maintain some type of emotional independence. Up to now, I would decide what to do. I would take recommendations from people, but ultimately I am the one who manages my life. And I have realized through this crisis, this darkness, that doing so only leads me to more pain and bankruptcy. So eventually the clarity becomes more possible to be able to let go. I love the way that C.S. Lewis presents this in his book, Mere Christianity, when he's talking about faith. And he says that in order to be able to arrive at this type of trust in God, relationship with Him, we need to discover our own bankruptcy. The fact that we have tried our very best to conform to His will at times, and that we have failed. We have discovered the bankruptcy of our own moral efforts in order to be able to engage in that loving relationship with Him, and that we just have to let go. We have to abandon ourselves into His love. And this is the point of the moral actions. Just our own efforts are not enough. And so this is a discovery which may take some time. It may be a gradual process. It's not something that eventually just happens in one day, even though in some occasions it could culminate in that type of discovery. More than often than not, it is something that happens gradually. And so we come to the crux of the matter. This type of trust in God goes by many names. Father Benedict Rochelle, in his book Spiritual Passages, he explains how the different spiritualities in the church is the same phenomenon. Father de Caussade, the French preacher in the 1800s, a beautiful treatise, Abandonment to Divine Providence. That's what it's all about. St. Ignatius Loyola in his spiritual exercises, and you have the Principle and Foundation, he talks about that holy indifference. It is the same thing. St. Francis and the perfect joy that he talks about, the same thing. And so we find it in the spiritualities of the Sacred Heart, devotion to the Sacred Heart of La Colombière, and we find it also in true devotion to Mary, St. Louis de Montfort. It is that complete abandonment, complete trust in God, complete confidence in God. And sometimes the writers who have written about these things have been accused of some sort of quietism. And it is because some of these moralists that will criticize this type of experiences, and probably they haven't gone through that sort of experience. But it is an experience where we realize that God is in control, that we don't have to be at the same time the screenwriter of the movie and the actor of the movie in order to be able to control how the play goes out. No, we leave it to God. It's not we who are in control of every aspect of our lives. The only thing that we need to do is God's will in the here and now. It's just like Mother Teresa of Calcutta would say to her nuns, God is not asking us to be successful, God is asking us to be faithful. The plan of divine providence, we have this paradox, the unity, the profound unity and connection between the spiritual and the psychosocial in man, so that the bankruptcy in the psychosocial, in the biological, in addictions, anxiety, depressions, all of those things that eventually bring to a bankruptcy of self, of darkness, is going to be precisely the way so that man can let go of something that is broken inside, that is much worse, that is self-centeredness. This is the spiritual brokenness. Yes, it is true that the brokenness of the body, of the psychological, it can bring untold misery just through anger, abuse, neglect, wars, eventually, all types of evils in society. And yet the worst thing that it can do, which in turn can become a blessing in disguise, is the destruction of self. When the human being finds himself in that darkness inside, still there the voice of God can be heard. The person can let go. Something beautiful can happen because we're now touching the spiritual. We're now capable of restoring something that was brokenness, something that is at the core of sin, which is that self-centeredness, that reliance upon self that is at the core of evil in man. So we come to realize that the root of that self-centeredness was pride. It's a spiritual sin, and it is a sin that is at the root of all of the other sins. It was necessary that we had faced those dark moments of darkness and those moments of bankruptcy. And that is not only for addictions, this is for all the types of human brokenness that we can find, either depression, all types of anxiety driven behaviors, eventually leads us to that brokenness. And that brokenness can lead us to the discovery that there is something inside of us that we need to let go, that we need to accept God's love, to embrace His leading us, and how difficult that is. Pride is very rooted in our condition. That desire to believe that our way is the best way and that we deserve better. We deserve recognition. We get offended if we don't. And it has been there since, yes, up to a certain point, it's been there since we were children. It is part of the human condition from that point of view. However, once we gain knowledge of ourselves from the point of view of our self-identity and a possession of ourselves, is something that the human being is called to mature and to leave behind in order to embrace a life that is going to be God-driven and not just self-driven, that is going to be loving as opposed to self-absorbed. It becomes an anomaly, and it becomes a destruction of human beings to have an adult behave in those ways. And yet, when we are capable of letting go, when we can abandon ourselves unto God, what peace, what a restoration, what sense of joy, of delight, not only in the soul, but everything. Father Benedict Groeschel again talks about the infused virtues being in action when someone that has been addicted all of a sudden ceases to have that problem. The 12 steps, they call it a spiritual awakening. It is that spiritual awakening, that light that comes from God, those infused virtues, the power of the Holy Spirit that comes to restore, to heal the person in order to be able to live a life of grace and live a life that is going to be for others. And this is what we're looking for. This is the restoration and the healing of a man.